Hi, and welcome to another video in the RHCE video series. Today's video is on Ansible configuration files. So when we're talking about the Ansible configuration files, we're specifically talking about there's a Ansible master configuration, which is ansible.cfg or the Ansible variable that allows us to set various configuration to the way that Ansible behaves. So if it needs, like the way it displays or how it does certain actions, etc. It's quite verbose and it's got quite a lot of options. A lot of it's on the Ansible documentation, but I'll just go through some of the more common ones perhaps today, and you're welcome to go and do further reading if that's something you're interested in. So let's just flick to my text editor here. So I've just listed out the 4 different methods that Ansible will actually get the configuration file and where the location of that the location of that file. So the first one, so it's actually in order of preference as well. So the first preference in this case is actually an Ansible _config environment variable. So you'd have to go and set that variable and set it to wherever the location of where that specific config file would be. You also have, secondly, then it would have an ansible.config that's in the current directory you're executing that playbook or whatever from. So that would make sense. Then you have project files. Again, you could have a local config file that sets specific settings for a particular project. You also have, then following on from that, you would have the option of the home directory. So it would then search the home directory for a .ansible.config file, which is, when it has a dot, obviously it's a hidden file, and that would be in the local home directory of the current user that's executing that. And then finally, etc. ansible.config. So that's the default directory, and that's where it will pretty much end up in most cases if you haven't set anything above in there. So it's the catch-all, and it's where the configuration gets stored by default. So let's go and have a look at that config file right now. Okay, so I've got the terminal here, so let's just open up the ansible.cfg. So get etc. ansible and then ansible.cfg or ansible.config. And yeah, you've got the web address or the config here. So as I mentioned here, that almost all the parameters can be overridden by an Ansible playbook, or with command line flags, and basically it's telling you the order in the documentation here, which is quite nice. It's really quite good. It's got that there. So there's some default values. So just telling you that all these things are already set, and unless you change these values, these is exactly where it'll search. So that inventory one, which we've been setting with -i to override the default, which is etc. Ansible hosts, we could actually just set it to a location on the disk that we always have our specific inventory on there. It could even be something that's being updated with using a script that perhaps searches for the systems, gathers them to a particular group, and then parses it into that text file, and then Ansible can then use that on with a dynamic method. There is some also stuff like you can fetch from like cloud, like perhaps from AWS, etc., to pull out the relevant data, and so you have an always up-to-date inventory file, and you're not pulling stuff or trying to query stuff that perhaps is no longer there, especially in cloud. That can happen quite regularly. So that inventory definitely is one of those ones that we need to know where to set that, and if we need to move it somewhere else, that's the place to do it. So the first thing obviously would be to uncomment that out to allow us to override that value, and then we'd have to go and set it here to, I don't know, oops, don't do that, definitely. We could just say I can't even think of a location now, etc. Let's do home, C England, and then Ansible perhaps, and then we could do project. No, that's not the project. Let's just do hosts. So now I'm just going to override that value, and that will look for every time for the inventory in that directory. So that's as easy as that. If I write that, that's written now. We've also, so stuff like the library, where it gets all its different modules, the utilities for those modules. In most cases, we wouldn't really touch that. It's very unlikely unless you happen to store it in some other location, or you need to move it for whatever reason. Then you just need to move those locations there. Where it's going to store stuff temporarily on the remote system. So there's actually a remote temp, so we can actually potentially specify this directory to somewhere a bit more sensible. As you can see, it's just in the whatever user's executing it, .ansible and then /temp. So in some cases, you may want to move that somewhere else, perhaps. Local temp is obviously locally on the system. Remote is being on the client itself. You've got some plugin filters config, and that's just the YAML file. We've got forks, how many it's going to run. So we've got intervals for polling. Who's a sudo user? It's in this root. Is it going to ask the sudo user's password? Yes. Is it going to ask the password if it needs it? Yes, again. And transport will be smart, so it's going to try and work out how it's going to connect in a smart manner. We've also got the remote port 22, so if you've got something like SSH on a different port, again, you can change it here. Module language is C, and the set locale is false. So a lot of these ones I probably would never touch and unlikely to ever touch, but it's good to know they're there, and maybe stuff like remote port, maybe you might change in some cases. And like I mentioned, if there's something in a specific project that you need to override in these values, you just set it in the Ansible playbook or with command line flag, or have a Ansible config in the working directory that has a different config as required. Another one I like is the roles path. So this is to search for additional roles. So it will actually look for in etc Ansible roles. So if there's any additional roles it may need to look for, again that'll be something like, as we mentioned in the previous video, it would normally be in another roles folder within the project. However, there may be ones that you want to have as standard across all projects, and you have some kind of roles directory that you can have, then you can have a link to that. Again, it's the same action there, just removing the hash at the start of that line, and then adding the directory to wherever the roles are. Another one interesting there is log path. So login is off by default unless you set it, unless this path is defined. And you've got log path equals var log ansible.log. So at the moment there's no log at all. So if we set this, then we will start logging to that directory. And as they mentioned, consider something like log rotate to rotate the logs after a certain amount of time. Otherwise this log can become pretty unwieldy as it grows and grows and grows and grows. The next one I want to go on about is retry files. I don't like using it, to be honest. I've used it in the past, but I do have a struggle to accept that it's 100% working, so I end up probably running the whole playbook again. So the idea behind this retry files is if a playbook fails, then it will create a .retry file, which is essentially allows you to retry the particular task that failed. But obviously it's failed in the middle of perhaps a long chain of different tasks, and so you can never be 100% sure that even if you may have fixed that problem that caused the task to fail, you may still have downstream issues somewhere, that it may have not applied a particular action, or the action may not have applied 100% correctly, because of that failed task. So I end up generally turning this off, and you can see it's actually disabled by default nowadays. But yeah, it is something you can go ahead and, if it's not already disabled, disable it and not use it. But it's up to you if you feel it's useful. It's certainly with smaller playbooks, it may be useful, but for the larger ones, I think most people just generally have it disabled. Another one would be host key checking. So when you log into a Ansible host for the first time, when you log into an SSH host for the first time, you'll actually get a warning that the key is not trusted, and it does have a list of trusted keys that allows that we allow to log in without that prompt, essentially, to say, do you trust this connection? And obviously it allows that, say if you rebuild the machine and it gets a new key, or for whatever reason someone generates a new key, we can then have that prompt come up and just say, this host has actually changed its key for SSH, and do we still actually want to trust this node? And what we'd have to do is actually go in and remove the old key and add this new key in. But yeah, you can actually remove this check-in if you're, because of, again, Ansible is pretty meant to be pretty much hands off in most cases. So perhaps in some cases you may want to just turn this off and allow it to connect. But obviously there is a security risk in there. But if there is some kind of, again, maybe a cloud example where machines are getting spun up constantly and spun back down, it may be a necessary evil to have this in place, unfortunately. Another one did I mention? I can't remember now. So if we go back to forks. So forks is how many systems we're going to run in parallel. No, sorry. So I don't know if I've described this one already, but forks is just a number of tasks it's going to run in parallel. So on a client, that is. So you can have potentially a load of tasks running at once, especially if they're larger tasks. Obviously, as long as they don't affect the chain in some way, so it allows that to happen. But again, I think 5 is probably a good value, and having on higher numbers obviously can cause bandwidth issues potentially, and lower obviously can be useful where clients can't handle that number of forks. So another one is colors. So for whatever reason, if you really don't like the colors that Ansible uses, we can actually customize that, and also we can just disable it entirely. So you do have that no colors 1 to disable the colors, obviously 0 by default. You can then go into just a section now. There should be. We go search for colors again. There should be a color section. Yep. So if we go in here, we can actually see all the different colors it's actually got set for the different actions, and we can change these values. It's mostly named here, like literally bright purple, red, dark gray, etc. Obviously, some of these things may not work. Again, it will be inside the documentation if you want to look at that a bit further. It's not something I don't think they will ask you to do in the exam necessarily. They may ask you to set one of these values to a specific value, but they won't just try and get you to guess what the value might be. So certainly that won't be something that you'd have to try and remember all the different possible colors that might be need to set. So persistent connection. So we've got a persistent connection is how long it will basically stay connected until it destroys the connection. So it's persistently staying connected, and then once that timeout reaches, it will destroy that connection. So that could be useful where you may not want to chop in and out of the connection constantly. Have a persistent connection to the system, and then if you're going to run another playbook 10 seconds later perhaps, you don't have to then reconnect to the system and rerun all the connections stuff. So you kind of saving that small amount of small amount of requests on the system there. You've got command timer, so that's how long it's going to wait for the actual command to be able to be idle. So obviously that should be less than the value of the connect timer. Obviously, if that makes sense. So this is pretty much all I wanted to cover. There are obviously a lot of options in here, and there's obviously additional ones that are not by default in this area here, but you can obviously have your own config files I mentioned earlier and set those in even a variable in the current working directory, in the Ansible config the home directory, or in this current file here. And obviously the Ansible script will use those as required. Well, let's do a quick test. Let's just do, I think it was, let's do playbooks 101. What we've got in here, we've got Ansible examples master. And we had that Tomcat standalone, I think we used last time. Okay, so before we had to, I think we had a host file here, and we had that symbol host. Yep. Okay. So at the moment we're having to specify that manually to find the Ansible, the location of this inventory file. So let's fix up the config file to then allow that to happen. So the first thing we need to do is let's get this working directory. It's a bit of a long one. Nonetheless, we'll use this, and it was just called hosts. Okay, so let's do a vim on our etc ansible.config, and what we'll do is we'll remove this entry in this one and put it back to what it was. Okay, so let's back to the default. Okay, and what we'll do is then copy this into here. So as I mentioned earlier, the local directory will override what's set. Wherever we'll search for the local directory for ansible.config first. So if I update this ansible.config, it then should look for the inventory file locally here. And so I won't have to do any extra actions, but just literally point it to the right file. Okay. So it was host, yep. So let's now run that script. So Ansible-playbook, I think it's site.yaml. And it looks like, yep, so it's picked up client 1, so it's picked up the machine it should be doing it on, and it's running the Ansible playbook quite happily. So I didn't need to do any kind of pointing it to the specific inventory file, because it can already go out and get that from the Ansible config file that's there. So I'll let this finish, and then we'll rerun it when I remove that file, and we'll just see the difference. Okay, so let's remove that file. Okay, so we no longer have that in a directory. We rerun the exact same command, provided the host list is empty. So that works absolutely fine. Cool, so that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. So just really more about the ansible.config file and how it all works and how to utilize that correctly. Yep, thanks everyone for viewing the video as always, and like and subscribe if you haven't already. So that concludes the video. As always, I've popped on the screen now my Ko-fi page. That's a great place to donate if that's something you're interested in, to help support this channel. Also, I've put the TeePublic page for any merchandise I've got. So I've got a few t-shirts and stuff like that, if that's anything you're interested in. And finally, I've put my Discord server details, as well as in the description for these things, details, so you can chat there. I'll try and answer questions when I've got a spare few minutes, and try and help you out where I can. Thank you.